Imagine, just for a second, that you are tasked with intentionally engineering the entire demographic makeup of a continent.
Right.
And I don't just mean, nudging it a little bit to the left or right. I mean, essentially trying to build it from the ground up.
Like a blank slate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Deciding exactly who gets to come, where they're originally from, and what specific jobs they're going to do once they step off the boat.
It really does sound like the plot of some dystopian science fiction novel, doesn't it?
It totally does.
Mm.
But we are doing a deep dive today into a time and a place where this massive societal engineering project actually happened.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to explore how a really potent mix of post-war panic, some truly massive logistical failures, and, well, one of the most ambitious construction projects in human history completely and entirely accidentally transformed Australia's national identity.
It really is a staggering sequence of events to look back on. And to guide our discussion and, help you understand how this all unfolded, we are drawing on a highly comprehensive historical overview. Specifically, we're looking at Wikipedia's heavily sourced article covering post-war immigration to Australia. It gives us this meticulous timeline and a really deep demographic breakdown of how this unprecedented shift actually played out on the ground, day by day, year by year.
It is such a wild, layered story, too, because it involves everything from catchy marketing slogans to literal boats just not being available when a government needed them.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this. We really have to start our timeline in the immediate aftermath of World War II. The globe is trying to put itself back together, and Australia is looking at its own borders with a profound sense of vulnerability.
Absolutely.
Set the scene for us. Why was the Australian government so on edge in 1945?
Well, to understand anything about modern Australia, you really have to understand the sheer terror that gripped the country during the war.
Yeah.
It's easy to look back now and think of it as just, economic anxiety, but it was much more visceral than that. You have to remember the attacks on Darwin.
Right, because a lot of people globally might not realize that the war actually reached Australian shores.
Exactly. Imperial Japanese forces actually bombed the northern coast of mainland Australia multiple times.
Wow.
So within the government of Prime Minister Ben Chifley, there was a very real, palpable fear of a full-scale invasion. They commissioned a report on their population, and the conclusion was incredibly stark.
Which was what?
The logic was that Australia was essentially a massive empty landmass, and they urgently needed a larger population simply to survive. It was fundamentally about defense.
They needed bodies?
They needed bodies to defend the continent, and they needed labor to develop the heavy infrastructure required to sustain that defense.
But they didn't just put out a vague call for more people, did they? The Chifley government actually set a very specific and frankly kind of terrifying mathematical goal for the country.
They did. They set an incredibly ambitious target, a 1% annual increase in the national population. And that was to be achieved entirely through immigration. If you think about what a 1% compounding increase means year over year,
It's massive.
it places an unbelievable strain on a nation's housing, its roads, its hospitals, its entire society.
Right.
To try and manage this chaos, in 1945, they established the first ever federal Department of Immigration. And the man they put in charge of this monumental task was Arthur Calwell, the first Minister for Immigration.
I have to imagine Caldwell had a nearly impossible job. He has to somehow sell this massive, unending influx of human beings to an Australian public that, up until that point, was historically very insular, very isolated, and predominantly of British descent. How do you even begin to market that kind of disruption to everyday people who are probably quite prejudiced against outsiders?
You lean heavily on fear, to be perfectly honest.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Calwell had to hammer home the existential threat to get the public on board, so he utilized a slogan that left absolutely no room for debate. The phrase was, "Populate or perish."
Populate or perish. It does not get much more dramatic than that.
No, it doesn't.
It sounds like a movie tagline. Though looking through the source material, I noticed Caldwell didn't actually invent that phrase himself, right?
That's correct. It was originally coined back in the 1930s by Billy Hughes, who was a former prime minister and the Minister for Health and Repatriation at the time.
Okay.
But Calwell is the one who really weaponized it for this specific post-war migration push.
But even if you scare the public into agreeing that they need more people, you still have the issue of local prejudice. You can't just drop hundreds of thousands of foreigners into small, insular towns and expect everything to go smoothly.
Which leads us to one of the most deliberate public relations campaigns in the country's history. Caldwell knew that if everyday Australians were openly hostile to the immigrants, the whole 1% project would collapse under the weight of social unrest.
Right.
What's fascinating here is how the government recognized the power of language in shaping public perception. Caldwell officially coined and pushed the term New Australians.
New Australians. It sounds very welcoming, very optimistic.
And that was precisely the intended psychological effect. The explicit goal of introducing new Australians to the national vocabulary was to actively suppress and replace the derogatory slurs that locals were throwing around at the time. Words like balt, pommy, and wog were highly prevalent. And the government realized they had to linguistically engineer acceptance. You have to train the locals on how to view these arrivals not as foreign threats, but as future citizens.
But let's be clear about who the government actually wanted these new Australians to be. Because at this time, Australia was operating under what was known as the White Australia policy, right? They had a highly curated vision for their demographics.
Absolutely. The White Australia policy was a deeply entrenched set of historical policies that essentially restricted non-white, non-European immigration.
Okay.
So under the Chifley government, the absolute overwhelming preference was for British migrants. Their initial rigid target was that 9 out of every 10 immigrants had to be British.
9 out of 10.
9 out of 10. They even set up an assisted passage migration scheme to heavily subsidize the journey for Britons just to hit that quota.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because you can draft all the rigid policies you want in a government office, but reality completely collided with their neatly drawn plans.
Yeah, it really did.
They had this strict 9 out of 10 rule.
Yeah.
But what was the massive logistical failure that threw a wrench into everything?
It comes down to maritime logistics. Britain had just survived a devastating years-long war. Their shipping capacity, their merchant navy, was severely diminished from pre-war levels.
So the boats just weren't there.
There literally were not enough physical boats in existence to transport the sheer volume of British people required to meet the Australian government's massive quota.
That is such a profound historical irony. The policy is legally set, the desire from the government is there, but the physical reality of boats on the water simply cannot accommodate it.
Exactly.
So if Britain couldn't send the ships, where did Australia look? How did they keep that 1% dream alive?
This shipping snag forced a monumental pivot. To maintain their numbers, they had to look beyond Great Britain. They turned to the International Refugee Organization, the IRO.
Okay.
And to solve the boat problem, the United States stepped in to provide the necessary shipping. Suddenly, Australia began bringing in tens of thousands of displaced persons from Eastern Europe.
And the scale of this pivot is just staggering. Give us a sense of the numbers we were talking about here with these European refugees.
To give you an idea of the sheer velocity, from the end of World War II up to the end of 1954, Australia resettled 182,159 people sponsored by the IRO.
Wow.
To put that in historical perspective, that is more people than the total number of convicts transported to Australia in the entire first 80 years of European settlement.
Wait, more Eastern European refugees in less than a decade than 8 decades of British convict ships.
Yes.
That is a mind-blowing statistic. But why these specific refugees? Did the government just take anyone the IRO offered?
Not at all. It's important to view this through the political lens of the era. The source highlights that the government wasn't just looking for warm bodies. They applied a very deliberate political filter.
Which was?
Many of these displaced persons from Eastern Europe were actively fleeing the Red Army. Because of that experience, they were staunchly anti-communist. From the perspective of the Australian government, which was heavily gripped by Cold War anxieties, this made them highly politically acceptable.
Okay, so picture this for a moment. You were one of these displaced persons. You've survived the war in Europe, you've boarded a U.S. ship, and you finally arrive in Australia. What actually happens when you get off the boat? It's not like you just stroll into a suburb, get a mortgage, and start working at the local bakery.
Far from it. The government established a massive, sprawling system of migrant reception and training centers to process these arrivals. The very first one, and ultimately the most famous and largest, opened in December 1947 in rural Victoria. It was called Bonagilla.
Bonagilla. I try to imagine the sensory shock of that experience for you. Coming from a freezing, war-torn European city, and suddenly you are placed in a former military camp in the Australian bush.
Yeah.
Corrugated iron huts, oppressive heat, dust everywhere. What was the actual processing routine like inside these camps?
It was essentially an assimilation factory. Bonagilla operated all the way until 1971, and over 300,000 migrants passed through its gates.
That's a lot of people.
The routine was strict. You would receive a general medical examination and an X-ray. They would issue you necessary clothing if you had none. You'd receive your initial social service payments.
Makes sense.
But most importantly, this is where you received mandatory instruction in the English language and the so-called Australian way of life. Finally, you were interviewed to determine your employment potential, and the government would effectively assign you a job.
I read in the source notes that the sheer volume of arrivals was actually tearing families apart logistically.
Yes. By 1951, the government had established 3 of these major reception centers, specifically for non-English-speaking displaced persons. But they also had to build 20 separate holding centers.
Why holding centers?
These were primarily used to house non-working dependents mothers and children because the men were immediately sent off to remote areas for labor, and the infrastructure just didn't exist to house whole families together at the work sites.
So you have families separated, hundreds of thousands of non-English speakers arriving, and local towns hearing foreign languages in their shops for the first time. How on earth did the government keep the Australian public from completely turning against this program?
They ran a highly calculated, continuous public relations campaign. They knew large numbers were intimidating, so they constantly humanized the migration scheme by celebrating very specific historical milestones in the press.
I found the marketing of this to be so fascinating. It was incredibly strategic.
It was. For example, in August 1949, there was massive media fanfare surrounding the 50,000th New Australian, specifically the 50,000th displaced person sponsored by the IRO.
And who was it?
It wasn't a burly laborer. They chose a little girl from Riga, Latvia. You can imagine the sympathetic photos in the newspapers. Then, a few years later, in 1954, they threw a massive celebration for the arrival of the 50,000th Dutch migrant.
But the real crowning PR achievement, the one that really shows the government's underlying anxieties, happened the following year, right? When they hit the 1 millionth post-war immigrant.
Exactly. In 1955, Australia welcomed its 1 millionth post-war immigrant. But for this massive milestone, the government did not choose a displaced person from Eastern Europe.
Right.
They chose Barbara Porritt, a 21-year-old newlywed from the United Kingdom. It was a deeply calculated choice intended to reassure a nervous public that the traditional British connection was still the ultimate priority, even though the actual demographics of who was arriving were rapidly shifting away from that.
And those demographics really were shifting dramatically. As we move out of the Chifley era and into the 1950s, Prime Minister Robert Menzies takes over in 1949, that original 9 out of 10 British plan completely falls apart, doesn't it?
It completely fractures. The British did remain the largest single component of arrivals until about 1953. But between 1953 and late 1956, migrants coming from Southern Europe, places like Italy and Greece, actually began outnumbering the British arrivals.
And how did the government react to their own policy, suddenly outpacing their cultural comfort zone?
With genuine alarm, the government panicked. In response to this demographic shift, they actively placed harsh restrictions on Southern Europeans who were trying to sponsor their family members to come over.
Damn.
Concurrently, they poured money into aggressive marketing campaigns specifically designed to boost British numbers. This is when you see the launch of the Bring Out a Britain campaign.
This is also the era of the famous 10-pound palms, right? Explain what that actually means for someone who has never heard that term.
Pom, or pommy, is colloquial Australian slang for a British person. The 10-pound part refers to an assisted passage scheme where British citizens could migrate to Australia for the heavily subsidized cost of just 10 British pounds.
That's nothing.
The government was practically paying them to come just to balance out the Southern Europeans.
So what does this all mean? The government is panicking about the influx of Southern Europeans. They are actively restricting their entry, and they are practically begging British people to come for 10 pounds. Yet they continue to bring the Europeans in. Why keep bringing them if it's causing such immense political anxiety?
It comes down to the brutal, unforgiving reality of nation building. The source material is quite explicit about the government's internal logic. A 1958 government leaflet was distributed to assure nervous voters, and it bluntly stated that unskilled non-British migrants were absolutely necessary for what they termed rugged projects.
Rugged projects. That sounds like code for something awful.
It was code for back-breaking labor. The leaflet stated these migrants were brought in to do the work that was, quote, not generally acceptable to Australians or British workers. The government needed a captive workforce that was in no position to say no to dangerous, isolated labor.
And there is absolutely no project more rugged, more dangerous, or more emblematic of this entire era than the Snowy Mountains scheme?
Without a doubt. The Snowy Mountains scheme remains the largest engineering project ever undertaken in Australia. Constructed between 1949 and 1974, it is a massive hydroelectricity and irrigation complex located in the freezing, mountainous southeast of the country.
Right.
We are talking about the construction of 16 major dams, 7 power stations, and over 140 kilometers of tunnels blasted through solid granite.
The scale of human capital required to build something like that in the 1950s is hard to wrap your head around. How many people did it take?
It required the employment of over 100,000 people over its lifespan, and these workers were living in incredibly isolated, often freezing, makeshift camps, and they came from over 30 different countries.
Incredible.
You had men who had been shooting at each other in Europe just a few years prior, now working shoulder to shoulder in the mud.
And this is where the demographic reality hits the hardest. Of those 100,000 workers blasting tunnels and pouring concrete, 70% of them were migrants. 70%.
That statistic is precisely why the Snowy Mountains scheme is widely considered by historians to denote the actual birth of multicultural Australia. The government may have desperately wanted a purely British migration wave, but it was the sweat and labor of Southern and Central Europeans that literally powered the modernization of the country.
Yeah.
They overcame immense language barriers and brutal conditions to build the infrastructure of the future.
It is the ultimate example of policy intentions meeting ground-level reality. The post-war wave of predominantly European immigration kept reshaping the country's food, its culture, and its cities for decades. But eventually, this specific, heavily curated era of policy had to come to an end. When does the book close on this chapter?
The historic shift occurred in 1973. By this time, Gough Whitlam is the prime minister. Under his government, Australia finally adopted a completely non-discriminatory immigration policy.
A huge change.
This effectively and officially put an end to long-standing white Australia policy that had historically restricted people from non-European or mixed-race backgrounds. The 1973 policy change closed the book on the strictly European-focused post-war wave, and it permanently opened the door to the contemporary wave of predominantly Asian immigration that continues to shape the country today.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, looking at where Australia is right now really makes those early post-war numbers look like just a prologue to a much larger story.
Sure.
Remember that terrifying Chifley-era goal of a 1% annual increase? What does the scale of immigration look like in the modern era?
The numbers today dwarf those early years. In September 2022, the Albanese government increased the permanent migration intake cap to 195,000 hours a year, primarily to ease post-pandemic workforce shortages. But the actual net overseas migration figure for the 2022-2023 period hit a staggering 536,000 people. That is the highest in Australian history.
500,000 people in a single year. It demonstrates how deeply ingrained immigration has become in the economic DNA of the country.
Absolutely. From the existential dread of invasion in 1945 to the complex workforce shortage calculations of 2022, the reliance on overseas arrivals to sustain, build, and grow the nation has remained a constant. The origins of those arrivals have drastically, wonderfully shifted, but the fundamental need for people has not.
It is an incredible journey for you to think about. An initiative that was born entirely out of wartime fear, a rigid defense strategy, and a deeply held, prejudiced desire to remain completely British, accidentally seeded one of the most vibrant multicultural societies on the planet.
Yeah, it really did.
And it was all heavily driven by the sheer unyielding labor demands of nation-building projects, so massive, so necessary, that they simply overrode the very prejudices of the people who commissioned them.
It's a profound historical irony. And as we wrap up our analysis of these sources, this raises an important question for you to mull over. Think back to that crucial turning point early in our timeline, the shipping snag.
Right.
If post-war Britain had not suffered such severe shipping shortages, Australia might have easily met its strict 9 out of 10 British quota. Could it be that a simple lack of available boats is the true accidental architect of modern Australian multiculturalism? And it makes you wonder what other massive defining cultural shifts in human history were actually just the result of a logistical failure.